Welcome everyone to ImaginativeVisions.com. Justin here. This is Gaming Central, and today we are going to be talking about a game that I feel honestly it has a niche audience. I'm part of that niche audience. Some might consider it cult these two games cult classics, but I wanted to talk about this because I would love to get another edition of this franchise in a more less budgeted, more AAA, or even just like a more AAA feel to it, for more realistic take with it. And today I want to talk about the Disaster Report games. I'm not going to do 3 and 4 yet. I'm going to just talk about the ones that was on the PlayStation 2, Disaster Report here, and Raw Danger over here in America. So let's talk a little bit about this and why I absolutely feel you should probably check it out here in the year 2026. So let's get to it. There are plenty of survival games where I'm armed with shotguns, rocket launchers, magical powers, or enough ammo to wipe out a small army. Then there's Disaster Report, a game where I could barely cross a bridge without falling flat on my face. The difference is exactly what makes this series so memorable to me. Disaster Report and its sequel, Raw Danger, are not polished blockbusters by any means. They are ambitious, they're awkward, they're definitely technically unstable, strangely at times gets emotional and occasionally hilarious, but not for the reasons developers were intending. In many ways, they feel like playable B movies, and I mean that in the most honest sense. And I mean that as a compliment as well, because I love B movies. These games understand something that many survival titles forget. Survival is not always about becoming more powerful, sometimes it's about being vulnerable, underprepared, or completely at the mercy of forces you cannot control. I'm not fighting zombies in this one, or monsters, or an evil corporation trying to take over the world. I'm searching for water, trying to stay warm, and helping injured survivors and hoping the ground beneath me does not collapse before I reach the other side. Even in 2026, very few games offer this type of experience. And just to give you a brief history of it, Disaster Report was developed by Irem and originally released in Japan in 2002 under the title, which I'm going to botch because you know how I am with my Japanese pronunciations, Zetsumei Toshi. It arrived in North America in 2003 as Disaster Report, and European gamers received it as SOS The Final Escape. Irem was best known for their arcade games and shooters, particularly the R Type series. So, a slow survival adventure about ordinary people trapped inside a natural disaster was an unusual direction for the company. Series creator Kazuma Kujo believed disasters were largely unexplored in video games, and they still are to this day. Movies have spent decades showing earthquakes, floods, fires, sinking cities, and collapsed buildings, but games usually place players in control of a soldier, superhero, or other characters that are capable of fighting their way through danger. And Kazuma wanted to create something different. Instead of allowing the player to defeat the disaster, the game will force them to endure it. And that idea became the foundation of the entire series. The characters are not trained rescue workers or hardened survivors. They're reporters, they're waiters, taxi drivers, students, ordinary people who happen to be in the wrong place at the worst possible time. Their biggest strengths are not weapons or special abilities. They survive by paying attention, conserving resources, solving environmental problems, and making difficult decisions about who they are willing to help. And that's one of the things that I personally loved about that concept because especially during that PS2 era, of course we had games like Hunting Ground and Resident Evil and a whole bunch of other different type of genre games, but this was so unique for its time. And I absolutely, once I saw it in the GamePro magazine and researching it, I was just like, okay, I was telling my brothers like we have to buy this game. But, story execution is one concept is one thing, execution is another, which we'll get into later. So the first game follows Keith Helm, a young news reporter traveling to Stiver Island to begin a new job. Unfortunately for Keith, his first day begins with the entire island falling apart. And Stiver Island is an enormous artificial landmass supporting a modern city, but shortly after Keith arrives, a powerful earthquake strikes, bridges collapse, Roads split open, buildings crumble, and a large section of the island begins to sink. I've had a few rough days at work, but Keith will win the competition in this. He begins the game stranded on a damaged bridge with no weapons, of course, no survival training, and very little understanding of what is happening. From there, he must cross the collapsed island, search for other survivors, and find a way to escape before the remaining structures disappear into the ocean. And then along the way, you meet a couple of characters such as Karen Morris and Kelly Austin. And depending on the decisions you make, Keith can travel with different companions, uncover different parts of the mystery, and reach several possible endings. And what begins as a straightforward disaster story eventually becomes an investigation into the creation of Stiver Island. Keith begins questioning whether the scale of the destruction is entirely natural or whether poor construction, corporate negligence, and political corruption have contributed to the catastrophe. And the game gradually adds conspiracy, betrayal, romance, even, and dramatic revelations to what initially appears to be a simple escape narrative. Now, the story is not presented with the confidence or polish of a major cinematic production. Characters often deliver emotional dialogue with stiff animations, but keep in mind, this is PlayStation 2 at the time. Strange pauses and facial expressions that barely change. Also, yeah, I know I just said PlayStation 2 at the time. Didn't mean like a knock at PlayStation 2. This was a budget game. I should have said that instead. Keith may narrowly avoid being crushed by collapsing buildings and then immediately begin speaking like he's conducting a routine interview. The contrast can be unintentionally funny, but it also gives the game its B movie type of charm that would disappear if everything was perfectly polished. And Keith never feels like the traditional hero sense. He looks tired, he's frightened, he's injured, and he's completely overwhelmed like any human being will be in this particular situation. If you're not trained, if God forbid if an earthquake happens and you don't know what to do, like you're trying to survive, you're gonna be weary. And as the game progresses, his clothing becomes damaged, which I really thought that was pretty cool for the PS2. His body became covered in bandages. His appearance reflects the journey that he's endured. And by the end, he does not look like someone who conquered the disaster. He looks like someone who somehow survived it. And that's what makes his journey feel more believable than the typical power fantasy. And that's one thing I really loved about the Disaster Report series was that initial concept of taking something that anybody on planet Earth, any human on planet Earth might encounter any given time, any given moment. It's just man versus nature. You had to like do your resources, and I'll get more into in depth with that when we talk about gameplay. But I love that concept, and like I said early in the beginning of the video, I will love to see something like this on a more larger scale, especially with the advancement of technology and gaming. I would love to see a Disaster Report 5 with the budget and team behind it that can really bring this thing to life. But let's talk a little bit more about the story and we'll get into the gameplay as well. Disaster Report before we head into Raw Danger. The biggest difference between Disaster Report and most survival games is the lack of traditional combat. I'm not searching for weapons, ammunition, or preparing for a boss battle. I'm looking for drinking water, medical supplies, tools, backpacks, and stable places to rest. Keith has a health meter and a QP meter that represents his physical energy and hydration. Running, climbing, and performing strenuous actions causes the meter to fall, which means I need to locate working taps, fountains, and other sources of clean water. I can also fill bottles to carry water with me, but inventory space is limited. That creates a simple but realistic and effective layer of resource management because every bottle occupies space that might be needed for a healing item or a puzzle object. The system changes the way I view the environment. In most games, a water fountain is decoration. In Disaster Report, it can be the most important object in the area. Seeing one creates an immediate feeling of relief because I never know how long it will be before another safe water source appears. Inventory capacity is determined by Keith's backpack. Larger backpacks can be discovered throughout the game, allowing me to carry more supplies and tools. And the game also includes collectible compasses, many of which have unusual or ridiculous designs. Thus, again, B movie feel. Searching for compasses during a citywide disaster sounds absurd, but the mixture of serious survival and strange humor fits the personality of the series perfectly. Aftershocks create another constant threat when the controller begins vibrating and the environment starts shaking. I need to crouch or brace Keith against something stable. Ignoring the warning can cause him to fall, take damage, or be struck by collapsing debris, which could mean game over in some cases. And the game uses these movements to make the city feel unpredictable. A street that appears safe can suddenly crack apart, a bridge may collapse while I am crossing it, and a hallway can become blocked moments after I enter it. The disaster cannot be defeated or controlled because it's Mother Nature. I can only absorb the warning signs and react quickly enough to survive it. But I do have to be honest about one thing. There are times when playing Disaster Report feels like I'm fighting Keith more than the earthquake. He turns slowly, struggles to line up with ladders or doors, and sometimes refuses to stand in the exact position required to interact with an object. The camera can also choose terrible angles during moments when precision is essential. Companions occasionally become stuck, take strange routes, or fail to follow properly. And there are sequences where the game is attempting to create this intense suspense, but I'm yelling at the screen because Keith will not face the correct direction. Failing because a bridge collapsed underneath me can be exciting. Failing because the character could not properly align himself with a ladder is much harder to forgive. And some of the clumsiness supports the fantasy. Keith is not a trained athlete or a hero or action hero, so it makes sense that he'll move cautiously through unstable environments. However, there's a difference between intentional vulnerability and the controls that feel like I'm attempting to just actively kill Keith. Disaster Report regularly crosses that line. Even with those frustrations, I find the game easier to forgive than many technical, smoother experiences. I'd rather play something ambitious and imperfect than something that would become truly, I will say, predictable. But the controls, not gonna lie, are rough. But you do get used to them after you start to get the hang of it. But the ideas underneath, I will say, makes the game much more forgiving. I would say Disaster Report controls kind of were, man, they were bad. They were bad. But like I said, once you get used to it, you will have some fun. Thankfully, there was a little bit of a slight improvement with the sequel we're about to talk about now, Raw Danger, which is actually still my favorite game out of the Disaster series. So let's talk about Raw Danger, which is the sequel to Disaster Report. And honestly, I think this is still, out of all the four games in this Disaster series, Raw Danger is still the best one. So Irem expanded the concept of Zettai Zetsumei Toshi 2, once again, botched it, Frozen Memories, which was released in Japan in 2006. The game arrived internationally in 2007 under the title Raw Danger. And honestly, I felt like that name change probably hurt the game because many players had no idea that it was a direct sequel to the Disaster Report. Someone who could have enjoyed the first game, seen Raw Danger at a store, and never realized that those two were connected. While the original focused on an earthquake, Raw Danger centered on a massive flood during freezing weather. The story takes place in Delray, where an enormous underground complex called Geo City is being celebrated with this elaborate opening ceremony. Heavy rain has already raised water levels throughout the area, and every warning sign suggests that holding a major event underground is a terrible idea. The ceremony continues anyway, the levees break, and flood water tears through the city. The setup immediately feels like the beginning of a disaster movie where, everyone obviously, they obviously ignore the warnings like until like it's too late. And me, I was a huge fan of this because by the time this game came out and by the time I played it, I was a huge fan of the Jake Gyllenhaal movie The Day After Tomorrow. So I was already just clamoring for another natural disaster game. And the glamorous ceremony quickly becomes a desperate struggle through flooded tunnels, ruined streets, damaged buildings, and freezing rain. But the biggest change is the use of multiple playable characters. Instead of following one protagonist, Raw Danger tells the story through several survivors whose journeys overlap. Joshua Harwell begins as a waiter working at GeoCity event, and Amber is being pursued by police officers while her hands are restrained. You have Isaac as a taxi driver attempting to navigate the flooded streets, and other characters are introduced later with their own motivations, relationships, and survival challenges. What I loved about this structure because it makes the city feel even more connected. And one character may move an object, open a path, rescue somebody, or leave behind an item, and then later on, another character can encounter the consequences of that decision. So locations that seem important during one chapter can appear again from a completely different perspective. And sometimes I cross paths with characters I previously controlled, and sometimes I realize that an action I barely considered has changed another person's journey. And that structure is not always clean, and the chronological order can become confusing, but the ambition is 100% undeniable. Irem was trying to create one large disaster in which multiple lives intersect, separate, and influence each other. And that remains an impressive idea, especially for a PlayStation 2 game. So the juggling of multiple characters sometimes leaves the game into some hilarious tone shifts and story structures that might be, when I'm looking back hindsight now, it worked, but it kind of disastrous. But the ambition was there, but just like the theme of this complete series, this franchise here, concepts are great, execution's another story. Raw Danger takes that B movie energy of the original and pushes it even further. The story includes corrupt officials, criminals, police chases, family conflict, romance, betrayal, a lot of things that you can think of. But as I was just saying, the tone can change without warning. One scene may focus on grief, fear, guilt, or even a death of a character. And then the next minute, you have two people calmly discussing their relationship while standing in freezing floodwater. So people stop during life-threatening situations to argue, confess their feelings, or explain their entire history as the city collapses around them. You might find that frustrating, but I, in a weird way, found it freaking entertaining. And that strange pacing, the awkward dialogue, it just gives it its personality. Like I said, there's a reason why this game has a cult following or a niche audience because it does feel like a low budget television movie that somehow received some type of structure of interactive drama. The English voice acting strengthens that concept, that B movie type of feel, because some performances are sincere and effective and knock it out of the park, while others sound like as though the actors received the script immediately before entering the recording booth, and characters can sound calm when they should be terrified, overly dramatic during minor moments, or emotionally disconnected from what's happening. And despite that awkward presentation, there is some genuine heart beneath the story. The game explores how ordinary people respond when everything around them disappears. Some people become brave while others become selfish and cruel. And that's one thing I really did like about this game is that there are moments in here where your choices will affect how certain characters view you. Um, and you can end up having a girlfriend with Joshua, but if you completely are addicted to her, she's going to despise you. She'll leave and do so. There are choices that have consequences, and sometimes your choices don't even matter. And that's one of the big gripes I've had with this series that they give you choices, but sometimes it doesn't matter. You go the same path. But as far as the gameplay goes, Raw Danger replaces the thirst mechanic from the first game with a body temperature and wetness system. Because the city is experiencing freezing rain and severe flooding, staying dry becomes essential. So, walking through water soaks the character's clothing, and remaining outside in the rain increases wetness. And as the body temperature falls, movement becomes slower and more difficult. If the character remains cold for too long, it can collapse. I have to locate heaters, fireplaces, dry shelters, warm food, and replacement clothing, which I thought was excellent. So there's a lot more detail compared to the disaster report. And this creates a different type of tension from the first game. In disaster report, water was something that you desperately needed. In Raw Danger, Water is something that you're constantly trying to avoid. A flooded road is not simply a visual obstacle. Entering it has consequences, so you have to consider the depths of the water, the distance to the next warm location, and whether the character can survive the journey while soaked. The system gives everything outdoor section a sense of danger because even standing still in the rain can become deadly. The clothing system was great too because it added personality. Different outfits provide different levels of warmth, but many of the options exist because the developers clearly understood that players enjoying customizing characters even during a catastrophe. Some outfits are practical, while others make the entire situation that B movie ridiculousness. The playable characters also approach survival differently. Joshua handles many physical challenges. Amber must navigate parts of the city while restrained, and Isaac uses his taxi during portions of his chapter. And these differences prevent structure from becoming repetitive. And the same flood affects every character, but each person experiences it through different sets of problems. And that's the great thing about Raw Danger. Now, let's talk about the graphics of Raw Danger because I didn't really get into how the game ran and how the game looks. I did say that the controls were clunky, but how was the frame rate? Frame rate can become unstable when the game is displaying rain or the earthquakes for a disaster report. And some scenes feel like the PlayStation 2 is begging the developers to stop adding water, especially for Raw Danger. The effects were not particularly convincing even when the game was new. Floodwater often resembled a moving sheet placed across the environment, and character animations were stiff. Facial expressions barely changed, and textures were money. And neither Disaster Report nor Raw Danger were visually impressive compared to larger PS2 releases. And the character models, like I said, were blocky, facial like expressions, and interior locations were kind of sparse. But however, I think the environmental transformation matters more than the raw details. These cities did not remain static. Roads did crack, bridges did collapse, buildings did sink, and water did rise. So they did good when in terms of capturing the natural disaster, and on a PS2 scale. The first game gradually dismantles Stiver Island around Keith. Each new section shows more damage than last, and creating the feeling that the entire island is being torn piece by piece. While Raw Danger created a colder, more miserable atmosphere through constant rain, dark streets, abandoned vehicles, flooded tunnels, and blue lighting. So, in terms of actual capturing the scale of a natural disaster on the PS2, I would say they did a good job of capturing the brutality of Mother Nature. And why do I feel you're probably hearing and probably asking yourself, you heard me say B movies this entire time of this video. Why do I feel like they're playable B movies? Because that's pretty much what it is. It's not an insult. It's one of the main reasons I enjoy them. A good B movie may not have the money for flawless effects or award-winning performances, but it compensates it with imagination, commitment, and personality. And that describes Disaster Report and Raw Danger perfectly. The destruction is enormous. The character models can barely express fear, but the stories deal with death, corruption, betrayal, desperation, and it really hams up the when it hams up, it hands up. And the fact that the tone constantly shifts between tension, comedy, and a lot of melodrama. Then, without warning, the game delivers moments that actually work. A character might make a sacrifice. A frightened survivor shows unexpected courage, or someone I believe was selfish reveals another side of themselves. It's a journey. The games may look cheap, but they never feel lazy. And Irem was attempting to create an experience that most developers were ignoring. The studio wanted to build survival around vulnerability instead of power, and that ambition gives the series more personality than technical superior games. And no, I feel like these games are overlooked in the PlayStation 2. Of course, they had stronger titles like GTA, Metal Gear Solid, Resident Evil, Silent Hill, Final Fantasy, God of War. I mean, the PlayStation 2 library was just absolutely ridiculous. But I feel like Raw Danger and Disaster Report, you know, or SOS for Europe, I feel like those games they they brought something new to the table that a lot of games weren't doing. Yeah, the graphics were rough and the reviews were mixed because of clunky controls, but these games knew exactly what they were going for, and I think they, for the most part, they did it. The franchise continued in Japan with a third entry for the PSP, which I'll probably get to later on, but it was canceled following the devastation earthquake and tsunami of 2011. And I will say later on, it did come out with Disaster Report 4 Summer Memories, which I honestly I felt I hate that game the most. And I remember when I did a review for it for Tacos and Geeks, my main gripe that I really hated, that really took me out of the immersion, was that they had an in-game ad for the game in-game, which means is that they had a poster while you're playing the game of Disaster Report 4 on the building while you're playing Disaster Report 4. Totally took me out of the immersion. I don't know why they put that in there. But to wrap this up, guys, modern survival games are usually larger, smoother, and filled with more systems. They have crafting, base building, and online multiplayer these days, skill trees, seasonal content, DLCs, enormous maps, and icons. Disaster Report and Raw Danger offer something more focused. There are no daily missions, premium currency, or endless resources to collect. Every location is part of one continuous journey, and every major item exists to help me survive the immediate situation. The original Disaster Report is the more contained experience, establishes a formula, and creates a strong sense of isolation as Keith crosses the collapsing Stiver Island. Raw Danger is more ambitious and truthfully the more superior game out of all of them, using multiple protagonists, interconnected chapters, clothing, vehicles, freezing weather, and branching decisions to push the concept even more. It also is the Stranger game, which is probably why I enjoy it so much. Neither title is easy to recommend without warning. The controls are going to frustrate the out of you. The camera will betray you. The frame rate will surrender, and the voice acting may completely destroy the immersion of a serious scene. You may fall and fail because a building collapse, but you may also fail because your character refused to face the correct direction. And but underneath those problems are two of the most original survival experiences for the PlayStation 2 era. They're tense without relying on monsters, funny without always intending to be, a dramatic without even ever becoming truly polished. This is an experience, to say the least. And I feel like even in 2026, it's still unique. Disaster Report and Raw Danger are not cult classics because they were perfect. They remember because they looked at uh they looked at games at the time and took risks, embraced unusual ideas, and had more personality than many games with far larger budgets. Sometimes the games I remember most are not the smoothest or most expensive. Sometimes they're just the ones that held together by ambition, awkward dialogue, and technical problems, and pure B movie energy. You know what? That's okay. This is Justin from imaginativevisions.com, Gaming Central. And if you're wondering about the third installment, the PSP, I might do it, but honestly, I really don't. I do not know if I can not only play the game again, the game's fine, but I don't know if I can keep listening to this girl in this weird cut of the song, that song, that song. If you know, you know. I don't think I could put myself through that song again. I played that game to death, and that, yeah. So it's Justin from Gaming Central. If you like what we do here, hopefully we earn your subscription. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe. Also, of course, gotta do some shameless plugging. My first novel ever, Where Light Remains, is coming out August 5th. The link is in the description. You can actually order the pre-order. You can pre-order the Kindle version. The print version will also be out August 5th, but unfortunately you can't order pre-order the print version, but you can order the Kindle version. So definitely check that out. And the Audible will be out on August later that August. So definitely check it out. The trailer's on the channel. So hope you enjoy. So I'll catch you on the next one, friends. Later days.